So, I want to ask you about the idea of like, okay, Zaha and some of them go and don't give a damn about the context or the brand is the most important thing, and some go to references. And this idea of referencing or trying to make relevance of someone's work, like especially this slide here, can you talk more about that?
Yes, I think that it's not that the work of the parametricist ignores context. In some ways, you'd say that it's all about context. It's just that the context they're interested in seems to be much more about the ground condition, geology, geography, and much less about the context of existing buildings and perhaps existing cultural conditions, because the reason they're being invited to do a building there in the first place is precisely because that's not what they do. And people say, we want a Zaha thing, or we want a Foster thing, or in London at the moment, you know, if we think about the west coast of America and Battersea Power Station as rather different cultural conditions, but who do they want to do their latest housing? They want Frank to do it, and they want Norman to do it. I think Zaha missed out on that one, in a sense, because they're going to do something completely different. Frank's doing buildings he describes as flowers. They're not flowers, they're like lever skin things that are bending about all over the place. It's going to be fantastic. And Norman's doing a snail, like that other one he's done along the river. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not contextual. It's got nothing to do with Battersea Power Station. Now, there are other architects. Given as an interesting example, the Australian architect, but he's kind of Singaporean, Kerry Hill, who has made a career in building in Singapore and actually across Asia, and he's essentially a Mesian. But what he's done, he's taken the context of the places where he's built, and for him, I think the most important thing is the context of latitude and of climate. And it's not simple, it's not just getting the sun path right, it's looking at that in a much more considered way and trying to work out how, in his case, a particular aesthetic, which he greatly admires, and his buildings, they're not all the same, but you can absolutely see the common strands in them. And yet, actually, the way that he's responded to climate, and in so doing, they're also responding to cultural conditions, so much determined by geography and climate, that he produces, I think, a very fine oeuvre, which is probably less well known internationally than it should be.
Okay. I find it always difficult, you know, to try to. Everyone has to find a legitimate way into introducing his project in a different context, and like I'm commenting on what you just said, and like everyone has his backing from whether it was geography, environment, or the heritage or the narratives of the city, and I'm just thinking what is the next question could be. So I think you can tell us more about what you think of these things.
Well, I'll give you one. I'll give you one. Well, an example of where you get a chance to see snapshots of what people from different cultures are doing, both in their own countries, but increasingly across the world, is in fact the World Architecture Festival, because, for example, we would have, let's say, 16 office buildings or 16 schools or 16 stadiums, and from there, they're from all around the world, and the first thing that you would notice now, which is certainly not true, I think, perhaps 20 years ago, is that you can make no bet when you look at a building in a particular city as to where the architects come from. Now, this is not the same thing as knowing where the materials have come from, because actually the use of kind of traditional and local materials may not give you many clues either. You look at a building in London, you see, oh, they've used traditional Cornish slate, but then you find out actually it's come from Brazil, because I'm told it's indistinguishable, but it's about half the price. So you can't make predictions about where the materials have come from, generally speaking, except in contexts where actually you know that very poor populations and they're rural areas, and you know that everything has got to be sourced pretty much locally because the money doesn't exist to kind of fly it in. But as to the architects, very, very difficult to tell. You couldn't guess it. And I think that that condition of architects increasingly working all over the world is fascinating, and the observation I'd make is, in the same way that you can't predict who the architect is, nor can you predict who in that architect's office, what country they have come from in designing that building. And all the big offices, and even small offices, certainly in any of the world's major cities, you walk in and it's the United Nations. The Architects Journal, we did interviews this morning for the Architects Journal Practice of the Year. And we interviewed 6 practices, and they all have a wide array of people from all sorts of countries. And one of the consequences of that, of course, is that they do start to work outside their own country, because there are people in the office who have family or connections or went to different schools or who know people who become clients in different countries. So you get this amazing sort of web of connections, which is quite remote from the, using the starchitects who get brought in as hired guns to give you cultural credibility or whatever it is that a city or a country might be seeking. And that's just part of I think a very rich tapestry, and why actually, especially talking about this in a place like the AA, which kind of had this in its, I know it's a cliche, kind of in its DNA from quite a long time ago. And now, in a sense, the world seems to have become a gigantic version of Bedford Square, sort of being built out quite often by AA alumni, I must say.
And with the WAF forum and award, what do you think about what's happening in the Middle East? Like when all these architects, whether star architects, and the production that has been happening in the Middle East, and a lot you see in the presentation, or like these screens of geometric, Islamic, or things, just to, a stamp on each of, even I saw the Fujimoto project, the design in the center where there's arches, that have some. So can you talk about the Middle East?
Well, I think I would say that the same thing applies, which is that some architects will take on board in very effective and very convincing, what Chris was saying earlier, in a sense, taking the best traditions of architectural culture and finding things and using them to great effect. Many other architects are basically commercial practices, and the only real attention they're paying is to whether the client needs to get their money out in 3 years or 5 years. So that's why you get situations where you get buildings where you have the most extraordinary expensive marble, but all the fixtures and fittings are trash, because the value there from a client's point of view is in that stonework. And you've got to have that. If you don't have maximum marble, your building doesn't count. But certain other things like insulation, you can forget all about it. So I think, unfortunately, my favourite example of the worst example of iconitis is, of course, the Sheikh Zayed Road, because every single building along there, or certainly every tower, has been designed probably on demand as an exclamation mark. But of course, if you have 100 exclamation marks, all you want is a nice, quiet sentence, some nice prose, and that's precisely what you don't get, with 1 or 2 exceptions. And actually the opportunity to do cultural buildings there, although people are rather mocking, about the Louvre doing stuff in the Gulf or anything like that, I think at the very least it creates an opportunity, usually for one of the usual gang to kind of fly in and win the competition. But nevertheless, it does offer a different model of architecture to that kind of relentless commercialism, which is not bad in itself, but the consequences, particularly at ground level, are a disaster of urban non-planning. Is that miserable enough?
Should we end here with this?